You smell a perfume and it reminds you of someone you loved years ago. You taste a dish and makes you think about something your mom served when you were a little child. You see a beautiful sunset and it reminds you of an important event earlier in your life. You hear some music and it evokes emotions that you heard when the music was first playing years ago. Or you touch a fabric and it reminds you of an important item you were wearing, perhaps at your wedding when you were younger. All of these things are related to the senses. The senses draw information into the brain and lock them in. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to use the senses to learn information faster and better. Now we're going to be using the senses to remember. Now there are 3 sensory wavelengths, and it's very important to recognize what they are. The first is visual, the second is auditory, and the third is kinesthetic, which is touch and smell and feeling. When we're using the senses, like visual, our brain becomes more engaged, and there are different ways to engage the brain with visual data. There's different dimensions of perception. Something could have color, or it could be black and white. Which do you think would be more stimulating? Generally speaking, color is more stimulating than black and white. So if you're looking at a black and white photo or diagram in a book, and you think of it as a colored diagram and book, it'll be more stimulating to your brain and help you retain it better. There's also the dimension of intensity. Things can be bright or things can be dim. If we're thinking about the sun in the middle of the day, it's very bright. Or the moon in the evening, it's dim compared to the sun. Or another way of looking at it is imagine you're reading a novel and it's describing how they're going into a deep, dark cave. Things are getting dimmer. The more we experience this change in the lightness or the temperature of the environment that we're reading about, the more our brain becomes engaged and the easier it becomes to remember. Size is another dimension. There's big and there's small. In fact, when I was studying psychology, this was very useful in a branch of psychology called behavior modification. Suppose somebody had a fear of snakes. One of the things they might do is show them a picture, and they wouldn't notice, but there's a really, really, really tiny picture of a snake in the middle of this picture of kitty cats or something really wonderful, soft and furry kitties, or something like snowballs, something that makes you feel wonderful. And as they're looking at these pictures, and often this was done on a screen, they would gradually make the snake get bigger and bigger. And what was happening was your brain was absorbing all of the pleasantries of the bigger object until the smaller object became big enough to be noticed. And then you weren't responding to it the same way. You transferred your emotions to the objects that were peaceful and tranquil. So we could see things as big or as small. In fact, one of the things I did in biology, and I've spoken to people who majored in biochemistry as well, you see things that are very small as being very large. So if I'm looking at a molecule that's extremely tiny and I'm visualizing it as very large and going inside it and looking at it from different angles and perspectives, I'm understanding how that molecule operates because I changed the scale on which I'm looking at it to make it easier to learn and remember. And that's precisely what my friend said he does. And he's got a PhD in biochemistry. And he would blow up the molecules in his imagination till they were gigantic. He'd literally walk through them to see what was happening. Distance can be an important dimension. Something can be near or something can be far. One of the things we can do to make something that's far become more memorable is to visualize ourselves approaching it and making it appear nearer. And as it gets nearer and nearer and nearer, it becomes more and more important and easier to remember. Motion is a powerful memory enhancer. Things that are moving are changing. Change is novelty. So when we see a still picture on a page, if we envision it as if it was in motion, our brain will become more activated and stimulated and retain the information more readily. And if you think about it, a lot of times they'll take pictures of things that appear to be moving to create the illusion of motion, because motion is an important part of stimulating memory. Stability is another dimension, constant versus flickering. For the most part, the brain will remember flickering better than something that's constant, and there's a reason. When something stays constant, it gradually fades from our attention. If you go into a room that's a little cold and you're sitting in it for a bit, most of the time you kind of tune out the cold. You go outside in the winter, it's a little chilly. When you go outside, you kind of, oh, it's cold. And then an hour later, you forget it's cold. You're too busy doing something else. Because it was constant, your brain tuned it out. Whereas flickering draws your attention because it's changing constantly. And change is something the brain is designed to pay attention to. Because things that are changing could potentially be hazardous or advantageous. At any rate, they're not what you expect. And so things that are unexpected and changing, like flickering, attract our attention. Hearing or auditory is another very powerful sense. And it also has different dimensions, like intensity. Something can be loud or soft. So if you're listening to someone whispering in a book or when you're learning, and you imagine it as if it was very loud, it suddenly becomes more memorable. That's actually a special effect you'll sometimes see in the movies. There'll be two characters in a scene, and there's a crowded room, and there's a lot of noise. It's loud, and they'll kind of pan in on the two key characters. And as they're panning in, they're slowly raising the sound of them speaking, and they're speaking softly, and as it becomes louder, you still know they're speaking softly in this loud room, and what they're saying suddenly becomes more meaningful and significant. So intensity is another important dimension. Distance is also important. Things can sound like they're close or far away, and that kind of illusion is an important one when you're reading. For example, if someone's being shot with an arrow in a cowboy novel, as the arrow's flying through the air, and you can hear the whoosh of the feathers as it's approaching the target, it becomes far more alarming than when you're hearing the twanging of the bow from a distance. So it's also an important dimension. Timbre is an interesting dimension. Timbre has a lot to do with, is it rhythmic or noise? And noise could be shouting or breaking glass or something that's sort of staticky versus playing a guitar or hearing music that has a constant beat or sound to it. And that's another important, easily remembered dimension. And quality. Quality is what distinguishes different instruments. A guitar playing the same song as a piano is quite distinct. We hear the same notes, but they don't sound the same because of the quality of the instrument. And if you play the same note on a drum that you played on the piano or guitar, again, it would have a very distinctive sound because of its quality. Pitch can be high or low, and pitch has a lot to do with how the brain learns as well. Anything that changes in general, if it goes from low to high or high to low, the change itself makes it memorable. The brain loves change. Now, kinesthetic sense is the sense of touch. It also involves taste and smell. One of the things we can experience is temperature, hot and cold. In fact, I have an interesting story about hot and cold. This is actually a true story. It's from biology. If you take a frog and you put it in a beaker of water and you slowly heat the water, very slowly, till it's boiling, the frog will not jump out of the beaker because the temperature changed so slowly it wasn't aware of the difference. and it literally dies in the boiling water. On the other hand, if you put a frog that isn't in boiling water near a container that's got boiling water, it's going to jump away because it feels the difference in the temperature. So temperature can make a big difference. And it's also very important when you're reading The Call of the Wild. It's a very famous novel, and one of the things they play with tremendously is cold, and how when the gentleman in the story spit, it was so cold it froze solid before it hit the ground. And they're using cold as a way of creating the ambiance, the atmosphere within the story. Temperature is a very important thing, helps us to remember. Dryness, desert versus wet. And we can feel the wetness of the ocean as we swim, and we can feel the heat from the sand as we walk over the dry sand. And the way we describe these things makes that experience more memorable to the brain. Toughness, rock hard versus pillow soft. Which would you rather be hit in the head with? A soft, mushy pillow or a hard, jagged rock? Toughness is another dimension of touch. And then we have roughness, which is like sandpaper versus something that's smooth. We can feel the difference in the texture. And so if I was describing a room and I talked about the roughness of the floor and the smoothness of the silky furniture covering, you would be experiencing it. And that makes it easier to remember. We remember these dimensions when we recall what it was we learned. It makes what we learned more distinguishable and easier to remember. Taste is also an important sense. For example, we have bitter and sweet. Most people would find sweet more rewarding than something that's bitter. But in either case, that experience, the taste itself, is something we can retain and recall. Sour versus salt is another distinguishable dimension. And here's one that many people are unfamiliar with and probably didn't hear about: umami. Umami is a relatively recent assignment of taste. It has a lot to do with the taste of meat. And for some reason, it's also related to the taste of tomatoes. And it's a specific taste that our tongues are sensitive to. Then we have the dimension of smell. It can smell sweet or acrid. It can smell pungent or not. But did you know that one of the things that helps to determine your life partner is smell? I know it sounds kind of strange, but it's true. I read it in a textbook that everybody has a unique scent. And somehow that scent is related to your genetics. Different genetic codes produce different scents. Turns out smell is actually one of the most powerful influences on memory scientifically. If you smell something while you're learning, it associates very, very immediately, and it permanently embeds itself. Another example is a baby that tripped on a floor that was recently washed with bleach. And for the rest of that baby's life, without realizing it, every time it smells bleach, it becomes uncomfortable because its brain is associating the fall with the smell of bleach. And in the same way, you can use smells in your material that you're learning to help lock memories in. Maybe you're learning about a forest fire that was very significant or historical. Like the Chicago fire, there's another good example. And instead of just reading about it, you imagine the smell of the burning buildings, the acrid smell. It'll lock the information more into your memory. Or you imagine you tripped over a skunk and it sprayed you. You're going to remember tripping over the skunk. Smell is one of the most powerful senses we have for memory. Moving on to exercises. Exercise 3, visual training. Practice makes perfect, so now let's train your inner visual abilities. Take 5 objects and create a mental picture of them, and then do the following. 1. Give it intense color and then convert it to a black and white image. 2. Make it bright and then dim it down. 3. Blow it out of proportion and then make it small. 4. Bring it close to you and then move it far away. 5. Animate it and then pause it. 6. Keep it still and then make it appear and disappear. Auditory training. Now let's train your inner auditory abilities. 1. Think of a song you recently heard and make it loud in your mind. Then make it soft. 2. How would it sound if the song is coming from nearby versus far away? 3. Compare rhythm and noise and see how subtle changes in the timbre make a big difference. And 4. Take a tone and convert it from a high pitch to a low pitch. Kinesthetic training. Now let's train your inner kinesthetic abilities. 1. Imagine how it would feel if you put your hand in hot water now. Imagine how cold water would feel. You need to really feel it, so intensify the temperature mentally if needed. 2. Compare the difference in touching something dry versus touching something wet. 3. Imagine the feeling of touching the hard floor versus the soft mattress. 4. Think of rubbing the surface of a smooth wall versus the rough surface of sandpaper. Taste training. Now let's train your inner smell and taste abilities. 1. Discern the difference between tasting something bitter, sweet, sour, salty, and umami. 2. Think about this dissimilarity in smelling something sweet, acrid, and pungent. Now that you know how to use the senses to lock information, you're ready to learn memory links, which will make it even easier to store and retrieve that information.